Try to put yourself in the shoes of someone living in the Middle East or Europe at the end of the First World War. It's difficult for us today to fully comprehend what that moment must have felt like. The fall of the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires fits more into the latter category. The lesson to be taken from such downfalls is that you can rarely calculate second-order effects, and that the inherent chaos of war can sometimes cause unintended consequences. After nearly 4 years of destruction and millions of deaths, there was a scramble to reshape what the world looked like. Borders were redrawn, new national identities began to take shape, and the principle of self-determination was enshrined as a cornerstone of the new international order. Moments like this don't come along very frequently. We've seen more recent examples like the violent breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, or the mostly peaceful but still turbulent dissolution of the Soviet Union. Both led to the birth of new countries, but the sheer scale of change after the First World War feels different. Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union were each less than a century old. While the German and Austro-Hungarian empires were relatively young, the Ottoman Empire had lasted over 6 centuries, and the Russian Empire, depending on when you date its origins, may have stretched back to the 1500s or earlier. The reason that I'm harping on this point is because I think it's important for us to try to put ourselves in the shoes of an average person, seeing the world around them crumble. The structures and routines that once shaped daily life were suddenly thrown into disarray. That includes the mundane, like who you pay taxes to, but also the profound, how you understand your nationality, your culture, or even your place in history. And so we return to our story, set in this cauldron of post-war chaos, and resume our breakdown of Episode 2 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, a miniseries by Darryl Cooper for the Martyr Made podcast. Cooper begins by asking a fundamental question. What makes a people? How are groups defined? How do hundreds of millions come to identify as American, rather than simply being a collection of individuals sharing a physical space? He tells us that, quote, when you look around the world today, you'll find that civil society, strong institutions, state legitimacy, these things exist almost universally in inverse proportion to the extent that people identify with the clan and give their primary loyalty to the extended family or tribe, end quote. He then offers an analogy drawn from The Godfather, focusing on Michael Corleone. In that world, loyalty is directed inward, toward the family and its survival. Broader society can't be trusted. The tribe comes first, second, and third. The in-group takes priority, while integration into the outside world is a distant concern. The implication is that internal advancement is prioritized over assimilation. He builds on this framework by saying, quote, figuring out how to get non-kin to cooperate in a sustainable way is a basic human social equation that very few groups ever solve. Doing it on this level has only happened very recently, and sustaining it is a balancing act, a very delicate one. End quote. Though he doesn't say it outright, Cooper is clearly drawing parallels to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through his commentary and analogies. The issue is that these comparisons are either factually flawed or directly contradict claims he made in Episode 1 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem. Let's break this down. By my reading, Cooper is suggesting, though not explicitly, that Jews are the implied subject in his critique of in-group preference. This is reinforced by his use of the Michael Corleone analogy. The underlying claim seems to be that Jews operate within an anachronistic clan-like structure, prioritizing the in-group over integration. The implication is that such a mindset, if widely adopted, would inhibit the development of civil society. The idea that tribal loyalty or filial piety has no role in building states, national identity, or civic institutions is simply ahistorical. In fact, such allegiances have often formed the backbone of legitimacy. Saudi Arabia, for instance, is founded on loyalty to the House of Saud, whose rule is reinforced by its custodianship of Islam's holiest sites in Mecca and Medina. Other modern examples include the United Arab Emirates, where familial loyalty is foundational to state formation. The UAE consists of 7 autonomous emirates, each ruled by a separate family. Law enforcement, economic policy, and religious affairs are largely localized, reflecting the decentralized clan-based structure. These examples demonstrate that loyalty to the in-group doesn't hinder state-building or national identity. It can enable it. In many cases, clan or familial bonds provide the very legitimacy and cohesion upon which states are constructed. The suggestion of some uniquely problematic in-group bias among Jews feels misplaced. Isn't that how most communities function? Societies thrive on cooperation, yes, but let's not pretend Catholics routinely donate to the Hindu American Foundation or that Mennonites are frequenting halal restaurants. Sure, Jews support their own cultural and religious institutions, just like every other group. Tacitly highlighting this as somehow unusual feels targeted. In fact, as Cooper himself describes in Episode 1, Jews at the turn of the century were deeply integrated into Western societies. They were awoken from this slumber by the actions of those outside of their community. The long excerpts that Cooper clumsily quotes from Theodor Herzl, the founding father of modern political Zionism, in Episode 1, actually underscore how strongly Jews sought assimilation into their home countries, but these efforts were often rebuffed in both Eastern and Western Europe. The same is true in parts of the Middle East, as reflected in examples we covered last episode, like the Epistle to Yemen and the Orphan Decrees. To claim that in-group bias is anything unique to Jews, or that a clan-based or familial-based structure can't be the bedrock of communities or states, just isn't the reality that we live in today. Cooper argues that trauma from World War I acted as a crucible for the birth of Arab nationalism. According to him, this trauma stemmed from 2 main sources: mass Arab casualties during the war and the duplicitous conduct of the Allied powers, primarily the British, in their dealings with Arab leaders. Undoubtedly, millions were killed within Ottoman territory, in part due to the war and in part due to Ottoman policy. War is tragic, but Cooper describes the devastation in the following terms, quote, "Native Arabs in the region had just lost more of their population than England and Germany lost during the Black Death of the 14th century. A third of the Arab population of Greater Syria was dead." End quote. There's no doubt that large numbers of Arab soldiers were conscripted by the French, British, and Ottoman forces during World War I and sent to the front to fight for their respective imperial overlords. It's also clear that millions of civilians died in the Ottoman Empire due to intentional persecution by Ottoman authorities. The total cumulative death toll in Ottoman lands is estimated to be around 3 million, a tragic loss of life. However, to claim that this death toll exceeds the number of lives lost in England and Germany during the height of the Black Plague in the 14th century is simply ahistorical. The pandemic wiped out between 30 and 50% of the populations of both countries. In England alone, this is estimated to have been between 2 and 3 million people. In total, Europe lost an estimated 25 to 30 million souls, a significant portion of which were within the Holy Roman Empire, Germany's precursor. While undoubtedly many people lost their lives in the Middle East and in Ottoman holdings during World War I, this comparison to Black Death-era Europe is completely off the mark. In addition to the poor comparison from a quantitative standpoint, Cooper claims that Arab suffering during the war was exacerbated by food shortages throughout the Middle East, which indeed occurred. The Ottomans hoarded resources, and certain areas like Mount Lebanon were severely affected by famine. According to Cooper, this suffering also stems from the broken promises made to Arab leaders by the British. He claims that much of the Arab world, from Syria to Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, looked to the Hashemites, who initiated the Arab Revolt of 1916, as a beacon of hope after years of suffering. They believed they would bring self-determination to the region, and an end to the strife, chaos, and death. But again, when recounting events related to the Hashemites and Arab efforts during the war, Cooper slips up, repeating some of the same mistakes we discussed last episode. He says, in reference to one of the sons of the Sharif of Mecca, quote, "Faisal had other problems brewing as well in late 1917. Even as Faisal's army began its second year of fighting and was pushing into Palestine with General Allenby to help liberate Jerusalem." End quote. Cooper repeats this claim again after stating the same thing in episode 1. This never happened. I'm not sure where he's getting this information. Faisal's troops never crossed the Jordan, never entered Palestine, and did not liberate Jerusalem. This was a purely British endeavor. This is basic historical fact, and Cooper continues to get it wrong. Faisal's troops advanced as far west as Aqaba, then pushed north into what is now Jordanian territory and eventually Syria. While they helped secure the flank of General Allenby's forces by taking Aqaba, claiming they participated in liberating Palestine from the Ottomans is incorrect. Cooper also repeats the erroneous claim we previously deconstructed regarding the Balfour Declaration and its supposed conflict with the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, under the assumption that Palestine had been promised to the Hashemites. We won't revisit this in detail, but as we covered in episode 1, all the British officials involved in the correspondence asserted that it was well understood that Hashemite influence did not extend west of the River Jordan. Cooper further reinforces his overtly anti-Zionist framing by invoking the King Crane Commission of 1919, a fact-finding mission dispatched to assess the situation in former Ottoman territories and provide input for the post-war negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference. The commission was named after its two members, Henry King and Charles Crane. Cooper claims that they initially approached their task with sympathy towards Zionism, stating, quote, "They write about how they went into their project predisposed toward the Zionist cause until arriving in Palestine." End quote. But there's a glaring issue with the framing Cooper presents. Charles Crane was openly hostile toward Jews and the idea of a Jewish state from the outset. A wealthy businessman who inherited his fortune, Crane used his wealth to fund extensive travel that sparked his interest in foreign policy. According to Crane's biographer, Leo Bocage, during one of these trips he met Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and dismissed reports of Cossack-led pogroms against Jews as a nuisance. President Taft appointed Crane as minister to China, but later rescinded the nomination, questioning his judgment after being confronted with Crane's open hatred of, quote, "Japs and Jews," end quote, leading Taft to conclude that Crane would have been, quote, "a dangerous appointment," end quote. Despite this, Crane was appointed to serve on the commission evaluating the situation in the Holy Land in 1919 and tasked with offering policy recommendations for the region in the aftermath of World War I. The commission ultimately recommended that Zionism be rejected, that no Jewish state be created, and that restrictions be placed on Jewish immigration to the region. In Robert Kaplan's The Arabists, The Romance of an American Elite, Kaplan writes the following about Crane, quote, "The most pronounced prejudice which dominated his thinking during later years was his unbridled dislike of Jews. According to his biographer, Crane tried to persuade the recently elected Franklin Roosevelt to shun the counsels of Felix Frankfurter and to avoid appointing other Jews to government posts." Crane envisioned a worldwide attempt on the part of the Jews to stamp out all religious life, and believed that only a coalition of Muslims and Roman Catholics would be strong enough to counter such efforts. In 1933, Crane even proposed to Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, that the Mufti opened talks with the Vatican to coordinate an anti-Jewish campaign. That perspective led Crane to develop an intense admiration for Adolf Hitler, whose Germany he considered the real political bulwark of Christian culture. A private audience with the Führer, like his earlier meeting with the Tsar, was easily arranged thanks to Crane's beliefs and financial clout. Hitler blamed the Jews for the problems in the Middle East, and at the same time, Crane, despite his hatred of Bolshevism, voiced support for Stalin's anti-Jewish purges in Soviet Russia. End quote. All of this tells us a great deal about Crane's frame of mind, and anyone suggesting he approached the commission in good faith should be met with serious skepticism. Crane had a well-documented animus toward Jews when he joined the commission in 1919. The man literally had a sit-down with Hitler just over a decade later. Anyone invoking the King Crane Commission as a moral authority or credible policy guide without acknowledging Charles Crane's deeply rooted anti-Semitism is failing even the most basic standard of historical diligence. They're appealing to an incredibly flawed authority as if it's some kind of yardstick for measuring blame. Around 1919 to 1920, events on the ground were shifting rapidly. By the end of 1919, the British informed Faisal that they were withdrawing from Syria and that the French would be taking their place. In January 1920, Emir Faisal signed an informal memorandum of understanding with the French, which outlined support for an Arab state in the region, the inclusion of French advisors in Syria, and a deferral of Syria's final status until a decision could be made by the League of Nations. Recall that Faisal was the son of the Sharif of Mecca, the king of the Hejaz, a coastal region in what is now Saudi Arabia. As an outsider with no native ties to Syria, Faisal was nonetheless embraced by many Syrians as a symbol of their hope for independence from the Ottomans. While they supported the idea of Arab self-rule, they weren't willing to replace one empire with another by becoming a French vassal state. Facing the looming threat of French occupation and the loss of British support, Faisal accepted the Syrian National Congress's proclamation, crowning him King of Syria in March 1920. The French viewed this move as a direct challenge to their interests and a breach of the informal agreement Faisal had just signed months earlier. 1 month later, at the San Remo Conference in April 1920, the Allied powers agreed to grant France a mandate over Syria and Lebanon, while Britain received mandates over Palestine, Iraq, and the area that would later become Transjordan. Amidst all of this, in March 1920, Arabs loyal to Faisal would raid Tel Hai, a Jewish settlement in the frontier region between Palestine and the French Mandate. A Russian Jewish veteran from the Russo-Japanese War named Joseph Trumpeldor was sent to the settlement before the raid to take charge. Due to the political uncertainty between Faisal's forces and the French, some northern settlements were evacuated, while others remained and received reinforcements. Tel Hai was among those that chose to stay and prepare for possible hostilities. Cooper explains that the settlers at Tel Hai declared neutrality, though it is true that French troops may have stayed in some of the Jewish settlements during their campaign. He claims that on March 1, 1920, an Arab search party entered Tel Hai looking for French soldiers, that the Jewish defenders opened fire, a ceasefire was declared during the fighting, and that the Jews subsequently broke that ceasefire. Cooper emphasizes the significance of this moment, portraying it as the first major episode of sustained violence between Jews and Arabs in the region, marking a shift from isolated clashes to broader conflict. Cooper tells us, quote, "As you can imagine, every single detail of this incident is controversial and emotionally charged. In fact, I should probably just put a disclaimer at the beginning of this episode to say that this is the case for every single part of this entire story, but I would still say it here because it's important. This is a watershed moment in the relationship between the two groups. This is an important point where something changes. For good Zionist historiography insists that this supposed search party was only using that excuse to harass and rob the Jewish settlement. The Arab versions often say that the shots fired by the Zionists after the ceasefire were an attack, not a mistake. Why it all started and how it proceeded is murky. No one really knows exactly what happened." End quote. Given how pivotal Cooper thinks this event is, one would think that references to sources contemporaneous with this raid would be used to refer to these events. I'd like to read an article from a Jewish newspaper called B'nai B'rith Messenger from May 21st, 1920. The article is titled "Heroic Defense at Tel Hai." Quote, "The complete story of the heroic defense of the Jewish colony at Tel Hai, and which resulted in the death of 6 colonists, including Captain Joseph Trumpeldor, who won rank and fame in the Jewish battalion which distinguished itself at Gallipoli, has been obtained by the American Zionist Publicity Department. 2 women are included in the roster of Tel Hai martyrs, Deborah Drackler and Sarah Chiswick, and also 2 demobilized Jewish legionnaires from America, Munter and Scharf. The territory around Metula, including Tel Hai, Hamra, and Kfar Galadi, has been the seat of hostilities between the local Arabs and the French. In the early part of January, Hamra was burnt down, and most of the colonists were obliged to evacuate Metula, where some French troops, after a fight with Arab forces, withdrew from the district. According to the press bureau of the Zionist Commission, the Arab chieftains repeatedly stated that they had no quarrel with the Jews, while the Jews made it equally clear they were entirely neutral and were taking no part in this Arab-French conflict. All that they desired as Jews was to continue peacefully, cultivating their lands. Owing to the absence of regular troops and the unsettled state of the district, it was necessary for the Jews to be armed in order to protect themselves against marauders and robbers who were taking advantage of the disturbed situation. The Zionist Commission, regarding these colonies as an integral part of Palestine, and with a view to safeguarding these possessions, took steps for the protection of Metula, Tel Hai, and Kfar Galadi against robbery, it being understood that the Jewish colonists would have nothing to do with attacks and that the Jewish workers would have to be temporarily withdrawn in case of an attack. From this point, the story is best told by the Palestine Weekly, Haaretz. On February 26th, Trumpeldor went up to Metula and drove out the company of robbers who had found a footing there. 2 days passed in peace and tranquility. Relations with the neighboring Metula and their leader, Habak Hamid, were most friendly, and the latter gave our young men opportunity to secure provisions. On March 1st, it seemed safe to take the cattle out for pasture. Trumpeldor was in Kfar Galadi together with Dr. Gary of the American Zionist Medical Unit. Suddenly, a few strangers were seen approaching Tel Hai. The cattle were brought back to the yard. Trumpeldor, with 8 men, left Galadi for Tel Hai. At the same time, the Sheikh of Halsa with 4 Arabic officers and a crowd of foot appeared. They asked Trumpeldor to permit them to enter the yard, which he allowed, as relations with the chiefs were always good. On several occasions, they had come with the excuse that they were searching for French soldiers, while at times they would help the colonists against robbers. Kamal Effendi, the leader, demanded the French. Trumpeldor suggested that he should look for them. The 5 visitors with Trumpeldor ascended to the upper story. Here were the 2 girls, Sarah Chiswick and Deborah Drachter, Munter and Scharf of the demobilized American Judeans, and Konevsky of the Hehalus. Something downstairs drew Trumpeldor's attention, and he descended quickly, saying to another person, "Go upstairs to the visitors." Before the latter had time to ascend, Deborah cried out from above and called to Trumpeldor, "They have taken the revolver from me." At the same moment, Trumpeldor saw that some of the crowd had also broken through into the yard and were trying to disarm the colonists who were guarding the gate. Trumpeldor gave the order to fire. A sharp exchange of bullets proceeded, and Trumpeldor was seriously wounded. Leaning against the wall, he continued to issue orders. There was a tumult in the yard. The visitors had fired from above, their bullets causing Trumpeldor's wounds, while below, one of the attackers hid under a table and fired from there. In the stable, 2 openings had been made through which to fire opposite the gate if this should be forced open by the attackers. Those who stood here, on guard, seeing the gate open, fired through the holes on hearing the order and prevented anyone from entering. Firing continued for more than an hour. Kamal Effendi then proposed to Trumpeldor that he and his friends should be allowed to go out and quiet the attackers, as a misunderstanding had occurred. Trumpeldor consented and gave the order to cease fire. One of the men guarding the gate, who had but 1 bullet left, said to Kamal Effendi, "This bullet was reserved for you, but as our officer orders that you be left alive, go." The visitors, excepting one who was killed below, went out, but after 15 minutes, the attack of the Arabs began again with greater force. Trumpeldor ordered fire until the last bullet. The attack continued for 2 hours, and finally compelled the attackers to flee, leaving behind 4 dead, a French machine gun, and about 15 wounded. End quote. Trumpeldor would later die from his wounds, reportedly declaring, "It is good to die for one's country," as some of his final words. But the broader point here is that this account of the Tel Hai raid is so fundamentally different from Cooper's version that they seem to come from entirely different realities. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide which version you find more credible, but I think this juxtaposition captures something essential about the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 2 deeply divergent historical narratives that can't be easily reconciled when placed side by side. In the wake of the Tel Hai raid in March, events escalated further in April 1920, coinciding with the annual Islamic festival of Nebi Musa, which honors the prophet Moses, or Musa in Arabic. Anticipating unrest due to the prior month's violence, the British deployed 188 troops to Jerusalem during the celebrations. Unfortunately, we're once again confronted with Cooper's careless quoting in his account of the festival. He writes, quote, "An article in the Times of London from 1920 describes what it was like. It must be admitted that trouble has been brewing for some time. The religious festivals seem to have brought the matters to a head. The Muslims have shown no hostility to the Christians when Christian and Muslim processions on April 2nd almost met. Not a word of hostility was uttered." End quote. But without breaking his quote, Cooper skips the very next line in the same Times of London article, quote, "The Muslim celebration of Nebi Musa lasts several days, and Muslims come into Jerusalem from all quarters. Their procession began on April 2nd, the only noteworthy feature being a man heading the procession carrying a drawn sword." End quote. Cooper picks up again, quote, a number of Muslims came into Jerusalem from Hebron on April 4th. When the procession was approaching the Jaffa Gate, the cry went up from outside the gate, "The Jews are attacking us." It is not known whether there was any foundation for the cry, but it started the trouble. End quote. He omits what follows next. Quote, "The lead man in the Muslim procession surged toward the gate, while the remainder halted and attacked any Jew in the vicinity, shouting, 'We won the country by the sword. We will keep the country by the sword.'" End quote. Cooper resumes, quote, "The Jews seem to have been prepared, for they were armed with knives." End quote. Kind of feels like a lot of cherry picking is going on, similar to what we saw in episode 1. This time, it feels like some of the omissions are purposefully trying to tone down the aggressiveness of the Arab procession before they go on a rampage. In the aftermath of the chaos, 5 Jews were killed, over 200 were injured, and there were numerous reports of sexual violence, including, according to Cooper, a report of a 15-year-old Jewish girl being gang-raped along with her sister. Just absolutely horrifying. Something notably absent from Cooper's account, especially surprising given how often he quotes from Israeli historian Tom Segev's One Palestine Complete, is that Segev writes that around 10:30 a.m., before the main outbreak of violence, Arab gangs surged through the narrow walkways of the Jewish quarter, attacking pedestrians and injuring at least one small boy. They broke into Jewish shops and looted them as residents hid in fear. That's crucial context leading up to the day's events, and it's genuinely surprising that Cooper omits it, especially given how frequently he cites that same book from Segev. But the quotation issues don't stop there. Cooper recounts an exchange following the Nebi Musa riots between Ronald Storrs, the British military governor of Jerusalem, and Menachem Usishkin, head of the Zionist Commission. Storrs visited Usishkin to express his sorrow over the events, and Usishkin responded by calling it a pogrom. As we've previously discussed, a pogrom implies state-sanctioned violence, so the charge here is that the British inaction enabled the attacks. Storrs rejected this characterization. Cooper quotes Usishkin as saying, quote, "You, Colonel, are an expert in administrative matters. I am an expert in pogroms, and I can assure you that there's no difference between the Jerusalem pogrom and the Kishinev pogrom. The organizers of the local pogrom didn't show any originality. They followed step by step the ways of the perpetrators of the Russian pogrom." End quote. Now, according to Tom Segev, that quote is largely accurate, though Cooper adds some editorial framing by presenting it as one continuous direct quote. Segev only quotes part of it directly. Still, there's nothing too egregious in that. But then Cooper continues with a second quote he attributes to Usishkin, quote, "Tsar Nicholas also did not interfere with the pogrom. He has also oppressed us, yet perhaps your excellency is aware of what has befallen him. In his place sits Trotsky. All our enemies in the world and in the land of Israel will also meet such an end." End quote. Well, that escalated quickly. Here, Usishkin appears to be overtly threatening the colonel, implying that he and the British might share the Tsar's fate, who along with his family were executed by the Bolsheviks. But there's one major issue. This second part of the quote doesn't seem to exist. It doesn't appear in Tom Segev's One Palestine Complete, nor in any of Benny Morris's work. This edition seems entirely fabricated. Now, I'm open to being proven wrong, but I haven't found this in any of the source material that refers to this conversation from the historians Cooper regularly quotes from, nor have I found it in papers that source the colonel's recollection of this meeting. If this edition was made up by Cooper unilaterally, which it seems like it is, that's an indictment against his credibility, since he'd be adding words that don't exist to a conversation between British and Zionist leaders. Cooper then uses this questionable quote to cast the Zionists in a sinister light, saying, quote, "He's telling a British military commander, well, really, the military commander in Jerusalem, that the British maybe ought to take note of what happened to Tsar Nicholas II in the Russian Empire after that regime failed to protect its Jewish population. And just to remind everyone, Tsar Nicholas was executed in a dirty cellar with his whole family, down to the little children, by a couple Jewish communists. End quote. There's a lot of animus here. Cooper appears to be using what looks like an invented quote to launch into an attack on the Zionists, and that's not even accounting for how he frames the Tsar's execution as being carried out by a couple Jewish communists, when in fact the execution squad numbered between 8 and 10 Bolsheviks, one of whom was definitely and another possibly Jewish. This all echoes the aftermath of Tsar Alexander II's assassination in 1881, when Jews were scapegoated and pogroms followed. Deja vu. Cooper's animus continues in the following statement, quote, "This drove the British Army crazy, right? They had just spent 2 years relying on the Arabs fighting alongside them, watching them risk their lives for their independence. Meanwhile, many of the Zionist leaders had spent most of the war supporting the Germans and the Ottoman Empire, and now that the war was over, they're just switching teams and streaming into Palestine, demanding that the British Army do their dirty work for them. The Arabs had fought for their independence. The Zionists had bought it at cocktail parties with the British politicians." End quote. The point he's making here is that the Arabs, through the Arab Revolt, fought for their independence, and the Zionists wined and dined British politicians. And sure, there was lobbying happening on the part of Weizmann and other Zionist leaders with the British, but Cooper's framing omits key facts, especially considering that earlier this episode he devotes considerable attention to Trumpeldor, the defender of Tel Hai. Trumpeldor, along with other early Zionist figures, helped organize the Zion Mule Corps, a unit composed of roughly 700 Jewish refugees from Ottoman Palestine, many of whom had been expelled by the Turks. Though a logistics unit, they served with the British Army during the Gallipoli campaign and operated under fire to support frontline troops. This was the first instance in modern history of Jews serving in a distinct military unit under the national banner of a sovereign power, an extraordinary fact that Cooper entirely omits. It's equally surprising that Cooper fails to mention the Jewish Legion, combat units composed of Jewish volunteers, including many army veterans of the Zion Mule Corps. These battalions served in the British Army during the Palestine campaign and took part in active combat against the Ottoman Empire. Many Zionist leaders actively supported the formation of these units as a way to demonstrate that Jews were prepared to fight for their right to national self-determination. And they did. They helped wrest control of Palestine away from the Ottoman Empire. To claim, as Cooper does, that Jews made no frontline contribution so as to delegitimize their post-war claims to the land is simply ahistorical. Another claim that Cooper manufactures is that Zionist leaders used the Nebi Musa riots as a tool to undermine Faisal. He says, quote, "Zionist leaders also knew that it was an opportunity. This was their moment. The French had been waiting for an excuse to just take the gloves off and really knuckle down on Faisal and the Syrians, and so the Zionists make sure that they have one. They spread word around Europe that innocent Jews are suffering pogroms in Jerusalem, of all places, and this gives the French the international political cover they need." End quote. There is no basis for this claim in the historical record. It collapses under basic scrutiny of the timeline. The Nebi Musa riots occurred in April 1920, a couple weeks before the San Remo Conference, which formally granted France the mandate for Syria. But crucially, the Syrian National Congress had already proclaimed Faisal king a month earlier in March 1920, an act the French considered a direct challenge to their authority. In response to that proclamation, French forces began mobilizing in Lebanon during March, well before the Nebi Musa disturbances. The idea that the French needed the riots as political cover to act is contradicted by their pre-existing preparations for military intervention. They didn't need another excuse, nor did they ever claim one. France's rationale rested on the mandate system, finalized at San Remo, which, in their view, legitimized their sovereignty over Syria. Moreover, Jewish communities under British control in Palestine had no jurisdictional or political link to Faisal's government in Damascus. The violence of Nebi Musa unfolded in Jerusalem, territory under British administration per the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the soon-to-be-confirmed British Mandate. The notion that Zionist leaders could or did weaponize the riots to provoke French intervention against Faisal's regime is not only unsupported, but also logically incoherent. It simply did not happen. We're getting into the thick of the region's historical details now, but that's what we do here. We live in the weeds. So, rewinding a bit to when the Ottomans ruled this area, they often appointed local families they believed they could trust to oversee day-to-day governance across the empire. We saw this play out earlier with Sharif Hussein and the Hashemites, who were originally entrusted with control over Mecca and its surrounding territory. Other families, similarly, were assigned administrative duties like tax collection and local law enforcement. In the context of the Holy Land, two prominent families stand out: the Husseinis and the Nashashibis. Members of both held significant roles. Some served as judges, others as municipal officials. They were, in essence, the local aristocracy. When the British assumed control of the region, these families, already deeply familiar with its political terrain, naturally sought to preserve their influence. The British, for their part, were more than willing to work with them. Part of the rivalry was ideological. The Nashashibis were generally seen as more moderate and open to negotiating with the Zionist movement in search of a diplomatic path, while the Husseinis took a hard-line, uncompromising stance and were staunchly anti-Zionist. Cooper argues that the British intentionally stoked divisions between these two families to fracture Palestinian society. As he puts it, quote, "See, colonial empires, they loved this trick. Everywhere you look, not just the British, all of them used it. It's very simple. You go into a territory, find whoever's out of power and unhappy about it, and put them in charge. They won't have legitimacy because the people will see them as your puppet. So they end up depending on you to stay in power." End quote. But there's a major flaw in that framing. The Ottomans were themselves a colonial empire. Turks weren't native to the Levant either, and they used the same strategy of appointing local elites to positions of authority. The prominence of families like the Husseinis and Nashashibis predates the British for exactly that reason. Cooper further claims that the British used Haj Amin al-Husseini, who they appointed Mufti of Jerusalem, to promote a stronger Islamic identity in Palestine in an effort to divide Muslim and Christian Arabs and weaken their collective stance against Zionism. Remember this name, Amin al-Husseini. He becomes an important figure, arguably setting the tone for the entire trajectory of this conflict. We'll be revisiting him. Husseini was appointed Mufti and President of the Supreme Muslim Council in January 1922. This role gave him authority over Muslim schools, religious courts, charitable endowments, and an annual budget of £50,000. It's easy to see why both the Husseinis and Nashashibis vied for these posts. Families like theirs had been navigating and leveraging such power structures for generations. Suggesting that the British were uniquely manipulative here overlooks the fact that the Ottomans had used similar methods. In fact, both the Husseinis and Nashashibis were part of the main Arab political body under the Mandate, the Palestine Arab Executive. As historian Benny Morris notes, quote, "Of the 29 members of the Palestine Arab Executive between 1920 and June 1928, at least 25% sold land to Jews or facilitated and profited from such sales, including the executive's president, Musa Kazim al-Husseini, and Raghib al-Nashashibi, Jerusalem's mayor, from 1920 to 1934. End quote. German consul Dr. Heinrich Wolff underscored the contradiction here by saying, quote, "Arab nationalists in daylight were crying out against Jewish immigration and in the darkness of night were selling lands to the Jews." End quote. Cooper tries to draw a parallel from the past to the present. He makes the claim that the Nashashibi-Husseini rivalry is similar to the modern rivalry between Palestinian factions like Hamas and Fatah. As he puts it, quote, "If this whole pattern seems eerily uncomfortably familiar, it should in our own day. The State of Israel has employed the exact same strategy to great effect, tolerating and at times encouraging Islamist groups as a counterweight to secular nationalists, whom Israel, wittingly or not, helps paint as collaborators. The most recent assault on Gaza in the summer of 2014 was launched just 3 months after the Islamist group Hamas and the Nationalist Party Fatah agreed to end their 8-year-long conflict and create a unity government. That was not a coincidence. The fact that this pattern is still repeating itself a century later is a little bit of a spoiler for this story. You know, it tells you that to this day, the Palestinian Arabs have not been able to overcome the combination of internal divisions and external obstacles to form a united Palestinian national identity." End quote. Cooper skips far ahead to the early 2000s here, when Israel, under the historically hawkish Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, unilaterally withdrew from Gaza and forcefully uprooted 10,000 Jews living there. Under pressure from the Bush administration, the Palestinian Legislative Council held elections, which Hamas won. This led to Hamas's violent 2007 takeover of Gaza from Fatah, in which over 100 Palestinians were killed. Israel then imposed a blockade to prevent heavy weapons from reaching a government that had openly declared its intent to destroy the Jewish state. Cooper's implication that Israel somehow inspired Hamas's violent Gaza takeover and that this is in any way comparable to the Husseini-Nashashibi clashes of the 1930s and earlier is laughable. As if Hamas wasn't going to seize power to begin with, so too is his portrayal of the 2014 Israeli Operation Protective Edge. Cooper once again completely mangles the timeline. By the time the operation launched in July 2014, hundreds of rockets had already been fired at Israel from Gaza that summer. Some estimates place the number above 800 in the preceding month, following the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers by Hamas-aligned factions in the West Bank. Secondly, the Hamas-Fatah unity government was essentially defunct by the time Protective Edge began. Hamas refused to cede control of Gaza, while Fatah refused to pay Hamas officials without proper vetting. I want to spend a second on this because what we see here is a fallacy that recurs throughout the history of this conflict. Cooper engages in it here, just as many others do. It's the notion that Israel attacks Palestinians in a vacuum, without provocation or context. There's no examination of the many inflection points that led us to this moment, or even, in Cooper's case, a serious engagement with recent history to explain why the Israelis are doing what they're doing. No mention of the Hamas kidnapping. No mention of the rockets raining down on Israeli civilian centers. It's all pathos, no analysis. A tired and banal way of discussing the conflict. Cooper drifts back to criticizing the supposed craftiness of the Zionists, marveling at how they allegedly cobbled together a singular national identity as if conjured from thin air. He says, quote, "To understand the ambition of what the Zionists are trying to do, of the scale of the difficulties that they're facing with this project, I always find myself coming back to one thing. I always come back to the fact that in the beginning, diaspora Jews who lived in different countries couldn't even speak to each other, because they don't speak the same language. So the Zionists are trying to draw together this community, right? They're trying to get people who have lived for generations in foreign cultures to identify with each other, to see that they are a culture unto themselves. I'm not so sure what's so hard to grasp here. Maybe, just maybe, the Jews didn't fabricate a shared identity out of thin air. Maybe they already had a deeply rooted collective history, religion, foundational myths, and holidays. Maybe the reason Jews could cooperate so quickly was because of an urgent existential need to do so. and maybe the groundwork for political Zionism was already embedded in this shared civilizational infrastructure. Or, yeah, maybe, sure, it was probably all just some elaborate global conspiracy or something, right? Cooper then pivots his critique by going after the ideological premise of Zionism, quoting Theodor Herzl, the founding father of modern political Zionism. He says, quote, "I will give you my definition of a nation, and you can add the adjective Jewish. A nation is, in my mind, a historical group of men of recognizable cohesion, held together by a common enemy. Then, if you add the word Jewish, you have what I understand to be the Jewish nation." End quote. Cooper elaborates, quote, "His very definition of a nation was a group held together by a common enemy. The Jewish nation he was trying to rally was to be held together by anti-Semitism. If one were to ask him what then was left of Jewish identity if you remove the anti-Semite, Herzl would have answered simply and quickly that there was no danger of that." End quote. He then doubles down, suggesting that if Jewish identity required anti-Semitism to survive, the Zionist movement would, quote, "find ways to make sure that anti-Semites remained in steady supply." End quote. Once again, the framing here is intentional. Cooper wants to paint Zionism as an inherently hostile ideology, but this contradicts what he previously acknowledged, that Zionism functioned as an existential life raft in the face of Jewish persecution across Europe, and, let's not forget, the Middle East too, though he conveniently skips that part. The idea that Jews needed to manufacture anti-Semitism to justify their nationalism is just nonsensical. Modern Zionism was a response to anti-Semitism. If Jews had been treated as equals in the diaspora after the Romans expelled them from Judea, it's very likely that the state of Israel would never have become necessary. Framing Zionism as if it caused anti-Semitism flips the historical order of events on its head. It's not just inaccurate, it's intellectually lazy. And yet Cooper keeps pushing this narrative by quoting David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister. In his memoirs, Ben-Gurion writes, quote, "For many of us, anti-Semitic feeling had little to do with our dedication to Zionism. I personally never suffered from anti-Semitic persecution." End quote. But context matters. Ben-Gurion was born in 1886 in Plonsk, Poland, then part of the Russian Empire's Pale of Settlement, the only region where Jews were legally allowed to reside. From birth, he lived under a regime of legalized discrimination. He may not have personally experienced a pogrom, but the institutionalized anti-Semitism of his time shaped the lives of his family, friends, and neighbors. I mean, he made the decision to leave for a reason. If life was so good for him and his family, why would he have left Poland to begin with? For some reason, Cooper seems determined to chip away at the very structural violence that gave rise to early modern Zionist thought in the first place. It's a strange pivot, and it's just one of many contradictions that have plagued this entire episode. Violence in the region escalated in 1921, beginning with a mass riot in Jaffa that soon spread to other parts of Mandatory Palestine. The initial spark was a street clash between two Jewish leftist factions, one communist, the other socialist. But what began as an ideological dispute quickly turned into something far more dangerous. Armed Arabs joined the fray, wielding swords and clubs, breaking into Jewish homes and businesses and murdering civilians. In response, the Haganah, a Jewish militia and precursor to the Israel Defense Forces, launched a reprisal attack. The Haganah had been formed just a year earlier, following the 1920 Nebi Musa riots, with the goal of providing a more organized and coordinated defense force to protect Jewish communities across the Mandate. The violence raged for a week, ending on May 7th. By then, 47 Jews had been killed and 146 injured, while 48 Arabs were killed and 73 injured. To grasp the scale of this unrest, it's important to understand just how unprecedented it was. Yes, there had been earlier clashes, Tel Hai, the Nebi Musa festival, but what unfolded in 1921 far surpassed those incidents. Historian Benny Morris offers a vivid summary. Quote, "The worst violence that day was a mob attack in which Arab policemen participated against an immigrants' hostel in Jaffa's Ajami quarter, where 13 Jews were killed and 26 wounded, shot, stabbed, and bludgeoned. The attack occurred more or less simultaneously with the outbreak in Mashia, which led the Zionist leaders to conclude that the violence had been premeditated." End quote. Morris continues, quote, "On May 2nd, in the Jaffa suburb of Abu Kabir, rioters murdered 6 Jews in an orange grove. One of the victims was Yosef Chaim Brenner. In the days that followed, the violence spread, fueled by the government's weak response and the poor performance of Jewish self-defense groups. East of Tel Aviv, in Petah Tikva, a well-organized assault by villagers and Bedouin tribesmen began at dawn on May 5th, with attacks launched simultaneously from the north and south. The Jewish defenders, armed with a handful of rifles and limited ammunition, managed to hold off the 2,000 or 3,000 attackers, most of whom lacked firearms. Eventually, a British relief column arrived, opening fire with machine guns on the northern front. A lone RAF plane bombed the Arab forces advancing from the south, and several armored cars joined the effort." End quote. Despite this British intervention, many had expected the military to serve as a neutral force in the conflict, but that expectation didn't match reality. In October 1921, General Walter Congreve, commander of British forces in the Middle East, admitted as such, stating bluntly, quote, "In the case of Palestine, the sympathies of the army are rather obviously with the Arabs." End quote. In the aftermath of what became known as the Jaffa riots, High Commissioner Herbert Samuel, himself a British Zionist, made a series of concessions to the Arab population in an attempt to restore order. He curtailed the scope of the Balfour Declaration by temporarily suspending Jewish immigration. Most significantly, he appointed Haj Amin al-Husseini as the Mufti of Jerusalem, an appointment that would have lasting consequences. And it's here that Episode 2 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem leaves us, after a period marked by unprecedented violence between 1920 and 1922, as tensions escalated between local Jewish and Arab populations. But Cooper doesn't quite end things there. Instead, he closes with an analogy that deserves to be quoted in full and examined closely. He tells us, quote, "Imagine you're in your home, and you hear a knock at the door, and you open the door, and it's a homeless man. He explains that he's hungry, cold, and has nowhere to go. He says that once long ago, when he was young, he lived in this house. He knows it's a strange request, but asks if he might have a corner to sleep and keep warm. You feel bad, so you agree. You let the man in and allow him to make a bed. But now imagine you come home to find that he's invited several of his friends to live with him in your house. Now, you're a little concerned because you have kids in the house, but when you try to talk to him about it, he just ignores you. And each day you come home and you find that he's invited more and more and more people. Imagine that his friends are treating you with contempt and beginning to talk about throwing you and your children out of the house altogether. When you confront the original man and ask him, what do you think he's doing? He tells you simply, what? I told you I used to live in this house. This is my house. I told you that. And now you're finding that his friends are changing the locks on doors and knocking down walls to remodel the place. You come home and find your children put out on the lawn because they've been moved out of their bedrooms, and so you call the police, but the police seem to have some kind of relationship with these people, so they do nothing. They tell you to relax. You have nothing to worry about. You know, before long you come home to find that you've been moved out of your bedroom into a closet, so you call the authorities, you call the FBI, the CIA, the US Army, and they all tell you there's nothing to be done since you know he did used to live here a long time ago. At what point do you put a body on this guy and throw him out of your house? Is it always wrong to be the first to get physical? Is that all there is to it, or is there ever a point when the only option you have is to hurt somebody?" End quote. The biggest issue with this framing, aside from Cooper's bias shining through after claiming to be a neutral Switzerland, is that the Jews were never invited into the house in the first place. In episode 1, we discussed the long tradition of Jews being treated as others. While Cooper hones in on this in the European context, he glosses over the treatment of Jewish communities in the Middle East, largely whitewashing their experiences. The implication that Jews were ever broadly welcomed in the Middle East after the destruction of Judea is a falsehood. We've already covered examples of this discrimination. Even in Ottoman Palestine, Jews were treated as third-class citizens compared to local Turks and Arabs. They had limited access to land, were excluded from positions of authority, and were confined to specific quarters. They were prohibited from riding horses and barred from building new synagogues or repairing existing ones. In 1834, 12 Jews were killed in a pogrom in Hebron, and that same year Jews were similarly attacked in Safed, where homes and synagogues were looted and burned. The idea that Jews were welcomed into the house with open arms may work as a punchy TikTok soundbite, but it collapses under even minimal scrutiny of the historical record. From the perspective of the Jews, the British had promised them a home where they could finally escape this long-standing persecution, and they were understandably eager to see that promise realized. We're skipping ahead slightly here, but it's worth noting that the Jewish leadership in the region agreed to several partition plans that would have divided the territory into Jewish and Arab states, plans that were rejected by Palestinian political leadership. Demographic upheaval in the wake of conflict is hardly unique to Palestine. After World War II, Germans moved from East Prussia westward. In 1947, the partition of India and Pakistan saw the movement of up to 15 million people, the largest mass migration in recorded history. The notion that Palestine is somehow a unique exception to this historical pattern is deeply flawed, especially considering that up until 1920, the Palestine Arab Congress regarded Palestine as part of Syria. Palestinian national identity was still in its infancy, and treating the region as an outlier reveals a shallow and almost unserious understanding of its history, given that the British had promised the Hashemites Arab territory from the northern border of Yemen all the way to Jordan. Politically, to Arab leadership, it wasn't good enough, and we'll keep seeing these kind of maximalist demands as a trend throughout this story. Episode 2 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem ends with the Levant in turmoil. With the First World War over, there's a scramble for land, influence, and identity. We'll continue our critique of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem next time, and we'll keep holding those making extraordinary claims accountable to the historical record. That brings us to the end of episode 2 of Crackpot History. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, feel free to share it with someone that you think would get something out of it as well. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.